So you can see down at the bottom the participants that are coming in. There's also a button that says Q&A, and that's where the questions will come in as well. Just going to wait 1 more minute so everyone can get set up.
Men du ser godt ud, Frank.
Tak lige måde.
Excellent. I think that might be everybody that's joining for now. All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. The subject is multi-channel mixing for streaming services and other multi-channel formats. And today we have 3 industry professionals who are working in quite different areas. We have Frank Grunbeck, who is mostly working with live and studio pop music. And then we have Morten Lindberg, and he is working with classical music. He's sitting in Norway. And we have Eddie Simonsen, who is in Denmark, and he's working with TV and film. So we're going to hear from each of them about the type of work they're doing and their working process and the tools they use, and of course what they think about this whole spatial immersive audio Dolby Atmos movement. We actually struggled to find a good title for the event today, but we're going to include all of these. It's not just about Dolby, it's not just about surround recording, so we're going to try and cover a bit of everything. And in case you missed it, last week we had a really nice webinar about the introduction to ADM and next generation audio with guests from the BBC, from Dolby and Fraunhofer. So check that out if you are new to the subject. Yeah, and before we get started, I just want to run a poll to see who our audience is today. So there are 2 questions. The first one is, what do you work with? I know we have quite a few students here today. You can click several of the options. Can you guys see this as well? In the panel, you can see it, yeah. And the second question is, which of the following have you used before? And you can click as many of them as you like. Normally in the Danish Sound Cluster, we have a lot of people working with audio products and audio technology and audio research. And I can see that some of them are here today as well, even though they're not directly working with content production. So that should make for a really good debate. Okay, great. I think everyone has answered. There you go. I'm going to leave that on the screen so you can see it. Eddie, Martin, and Frank, so you know who you're talking to. If you have any questions for our guests today, you can write it in the Q&A section, or if you just have some comment or feedback, you can write it in the chat, and we will take the questions along the way. All of the guys here have said that we can interrupt them at any time, so be a bit informal. Feel free to join the discussion, and yeah, you will get more out of it if you're involved. So let's start with Frank. Hi, Frank. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, Charlie.
Yeah.
Absolutely welcome. Thanks for the invitation. I'm actually I'm just looking at this poll of yours, and I see that 38% actually have listened to Dolby Atmos in multi-channel speaker systems. That's very interesting. I find that that's quite cool. A short introduction to who I am and what I do is I have worked somewhat 25 years in the audio industry with different lines of work. Primarily, I started as a student at the conservatorium in Copenhagen as the first line that was there. So I'm educated as a sound engineer from the rhythmical conservatorium in Copenhagen. Then I've been working in all kinds of studio relations from there, and also had my own studio for 10 years, something like that, back in the zeros. Then I went to the audio industry, or the live audio industry for several years. I did a lot of musicals. I've done a lot of live engineering in general, with Lucas Graham as the last thing what I'm still doing in front of house for Lucas. I've recently also, or during the last 5 years, been working with a musical production company that's called Langkær Entertainment, and just changed its name to Lion Entertainment, where I actually also work in immersive live formats with theater. And one of the recent things that we did was with Meyer Sound have created something that's called Space Map, which is a live tool to also have objects moving around, and still also a little, you get a little the same options to have a bed and objects put on top, and we mixed a complete musical in 5.1, and had the surrounds were 2 rows of 8 speakers in the ceiling. So we had the possibility to do a lot of immersive stuff in the ceiling, with so many points. So that was quite interesting. Then I started working with Nordic Pro Audio, selling studio and live equipment, and broadcast equipment as well. That's actually mainly what we sell. But I have found this kind of niche with this multi-channel systems, because my relation with Meyer Sound is quite strong, and also with merging and with SSL, and they all have this immersive format going on in a lot of their products, all of them. So and in that way, I have come to know about Atmos music mixing, and I've built a studio facility at our office in Rødovre, and I also built my own afterwards, because I was so tempted by this Atmos format, that I could see that it would actually also be something that could be potentially a business for my company as well. So, and that's where I've been. I've had the pleasure of digging into this whole new way of working with pop music in this multi-channel format, and my experience is primarily with Dolby Atmos, so I won't be in studio relation. so mixing in that format has been my main thing when it comes to pop music, besides of course stereo mixing. And it's just a whole new world that has opened up, and I was simply just taken by storm with this, because there's so many possibilities and so many ways of diving into this format in different ways, creating a space. That's actually one of the things that I also have mentioned as a kind of a headline for the speak is elevating music into a spatial environment, and that's actually what I see is the possible way of working with pop music, because it's so stereo orientated, and everything, whenever I get tracks, the most of them is literally in stereo. So there's nearly no one giving me any tracks in either mono or multi-channel setups. So everyone kind of just hands in stereo files, even though I try to ask for mono files or multi-channel things. That's just it comes all from stereo, and it's then my task to kind of to place this in the environment somehow. And my tools for that, of course, I need to mention that as well, is that I have it's a Pro Tools setup, and I'm using the Dolby Atmos audio suite, so I do not have a hardware render but a software render. And besides that, it's all in the box mixing. I have a bunch of UAD stuff, and I'm using a lot of those plugins, even though they don't have just a single plugin that's actually multi-channel based. Maybe some guys from Universal Audio should hear that, because that would be very nice if they could do that. But actually there's a lot of these tools that I usually have been using, creating music with waves and UAD, which is a lot of, from where I come from, they actually don't support any of this. So one has to kind of create his own or one's own way of using these in a multi-channel format. And there's of course pros and cons in working with these effects and these dynamics in mono based setups. That of course has some benefits, but also has some difficulties built in. Then I have a Maya Sound speaker system. Yeah, and that's basically my setup. And it's a 7.1.4 system that I'm mixing in.
Great.
Uh,
And that's what you're delivering, or it doesn't matter because you're just delivering a Dolby Atmos file.
Yeah, but the delivery for Atmos is actually 7.1.2, and then that's also a thing that's super interesting. I actually I had the chance via connections with Universal in UK and with Warner in US, to hear some other people, some other technicians' stuff, and see how they work as well, which has been quite interesting, because the way that I usually work is that I use the bed structure from within the program or the audio workstation, and then I use the bed system connected directly to the renderer. But there's actually a lot of these technicians who doesn't use the bed structure at all, but creates their own object-based bed structure, which makes it possible. There's different pros and cons for doing that. One of the things that you can gain is that you can gain a better control about mixing in 9.1.6. And Morten, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the thing is that I could technically, in my 7.1.4 speaker system, mix in 9.1.6 by making these beds, this bed structure that actually delivers a speaker that I'm not having, but it places it in the room, and you can then specifically send things to these speakers. So people with a bigger system than I have would then have the option to listen to it, listen back to it in that way. So more specific, aimed for 9.1.6.
But Frank, can I ask?
Yeah.
Even if you deliver something in 9.1.4, sorry, 7.1.2, and they have their 9.1.6, it will upmix to that anyways.
No, but the basics are that 7.1.2 is this the 7.1 that we know, so 3 in the front and the 4 in the back, the subwoofer, of course, but the ceiling will then be left-right ceiling. But but your objects can be up until 9.1.6. So the home entertainment Atmos format, which is what we are talking about here, or which I'm working in. Eddie can elaborate a lot about the Atmos format that's significantly bigger than that. But in this, because then it gets cinematic beyond 9.1.6. Or I actually think that they have maybe opened up for 11.1.8. Now I'm a little shaky because I'm not absolutely sure about it. But at least 9.1.6 is what is the maximum streamed service. And if we are talking about that, then that's the maximum stream you can have.
May I comment on that?
Yeah,
Frank?
of course.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right in everything you say. But it's more a matter of mentality when you dive into the mix, where it's easy to get lost in the bed channels and in number of objects. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we are actually creating for a field, for a sphere, and how that is rendered to any given configuration of speakers, that is totally flexible within the whole system. So it's a matter when you say when you have 5.1, whatever you do in between that will be pointed as a kind of a phantom imaging in your playback. But whereas when it's rendered to a larger setup with a different speaker configuration, then you can have in-speaker placement for that. But there's a lot of ifs here, and I would say that all the systems we work with, they are in their infancy. So for every day we work, we discover new traps, new functionality that actually renders differently on coming out of a different workstation. So yeah, we can come back to that
also
later. Yeah, but I think it's important with the mentality that we are actually leaving the number of speakers and actually mixing for an environment.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That also, and that's actually one of the you mentioned, Morten, also that it's kind of a transport. That the formats are kind of a transport when we talked earlier today, and Atmos is just one way of doing this transport, but it's been taken in by all these streaming services, and of course therefore easy to get, as opposed to a lot of other formats that's out there. So it's quite easy to be able to download in the formats and streaming in the format, as opposed to some of the other available systems or formats. Sorry. But in terms of this, in my workflow, if I can come back to that with these with this bed structure and this object structure, it's just interesting to see that that for me, when I've working this in this format, there's a lot of comparison into stereo, because there's this whole built in this format of Atmos is actually kind of two formats in one. It's the binaural format, and it's the speaker layout format, or should we say the field format, which is depending on how big a system you have of speakers. But these two are quite different in the way that one can experience this immersive field around you, whereas the speaker system is of course fully capable of playing audio from all directions. The binaural within, at least within the Atmos format, is more like distancing towards your ears in this way. You can't do like this, and that is, of course, it makes the comparison between stereo and binaural gets to be a super important connection, because a lot of people will listen to this in binaural. So when we sit and mix in the full speaker system, we will maybe, I don't know, I actually haven't seen any percentage of how big the audience is for multi-channel systems versus binaural listening in their iPhones or whatever phones that actually supports this format. But there's quite a lot, of course, listening in binaural, and it's interesting to see how these people that I have worked with, at least, how much they actually look into, they want kind of the same format, because that they see that it's two speakers on your head, so it has to sound somewhat the same. And that's just super interesting, because it's so opposite of what I want to create. I want to create a space that's different. I want to create that you can go into the music and experience a closer music, or you get a closer musical experience that enhances size and enhances details, because the room that's around you is so much bigger, or the space that is around you is so much bigger, and it opens up for so many more details that actually disappears in the stereo very often. And there's a lot of loudness fighting in the pop industry, and and of course, this loudness thing is also a thing that I'm very aware of, and I have to be super aware all the time about what the deliveries should end in, and how then the loudness of these reacts compared to the stereo file. And it's I've had a lot of talks with some of the tech guys from Universal, whose Universal Music has an office in London who gets all the ADM files for all music that's produced in Atmos in my territory, at least. I don't know. I never experienced that I had to hand in stereo files to anyone else than a local service. But everyone turns things into a special account in at Universal, and these people that sits in this office, they actually check exactly what you send to them. So they compare the stereo file and the Atmos file very thoroughly. And if I do anything, if there's anything missing or anything that's placed differently in your binaural mix, for instance, the first album I did, I had some songs where I deliberately turned some percussion from left to right, for instance. I immediately got a phone call. Oh, did you do this is that on purpose? Or is it actually
Ludicrous.
exactly, was this intentionally, or did you actually do it wrong? And so this whole connection between these formats is kind of an ingrowing conflict, because it makes people want to, we want to produce things that's spacious, but at the same time we also are asked to kind of deliver something that is very close to the original product, and they simply look into this as a product itself. So, and it's quite interesting to see what this does, and what the requests are from some of the guys from the labels. I would say, although it's of course super interesting to then sit and listen to, especially back catalog things on Apple Music, for instance, and see that how many things has been delivered in such super nice spatial way, and it really elevates the music completely into a totally new standard. And I've Bob Marley's complete greatest hits is available, for instance, and it's really interesting how a static mix, there's absolutely nothing that moves, but it's just a static mix that's just surrounding you completely, and it sounds super much better than the old original in stereo. But
Yeah,
there's also things that does the opposite from, yeah, it's very interesting, actually.
get more boring, less exciting. No, but Frank, whenever we spoke a while back, you mentioned quite a lot of examples actually, and perhaps you could send us a link to those, and we can include it in the follow-up email
Yeah,
afterwards, because you had some good examples of things productions that you do like.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally. There's also a bunch that I don't like.
Yeah.
Which is also interesting, but I'll choose not to do and send any links of those. But I find there is a tendency towards stereo mixing in Atmos. That's some of the requests that I have had has been, could you please create like a stereo mix of this?
At the moment, hopefully that will change.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly where it's super interesting to. Morten just told me that he's. Can you hear all these?
Yeah.
I get.
Is it your phone?
But it's my phone and my.
No, it's the Q&As coming in
Yeah,
too
it's
soon.
all the questions.
Okay. No, but it's just interesting to hear also from Morten that there's some that the whole way of thinking is starting in multi-channels system, and it's a totally different world that where it origins than from where
What
I
you're working with. Yeah.
yeah.
I have a question for you about depth perception. If Does the Dolby Atmos tool, when you're listening, for example, to a stereo mix on headphones and then a Dolby Atmos mix on the binaural, does it allow you to really create this new space if you didn't have to listen to the record labels and make a tame mix? Are you still able to create an exciting mix for headphones with their tool?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. You definitely, and I'm sure Morten will, and Eddie for that matter, would agree that it's definitely possible, but it's difficult to maintain the same loudness rules and maintain the same energy in the music. Um, so you have to see it as two different formats then, or at least if I could choose, I would very much like to deliver a binaural mix
Yeah.
and a 7.1.2 mix.
I
This
see.
is exactly the challenge we have right now, because it is simply not possible to make the single delivery in one file that will perform optimal on a speaker system and on virtualization for headphones. I find that my reference is a speaker, what's sounding in the room. When trying to prepare the binaural, I do not have enough tools. I do not have enough sets of metadata of instructions of how that rendering is going to happen. So it's I would mix differently for a binaural than
Totally.
I would for speakers. So we are posed with an almost impossible task at the moment with that single file delivery for those two worlds in one. And also given the fact that the services out there have their own algorithms for how that binaural is going to be rendered.
Yeah.
Because we all know that Apple disregards all our metadata for the binaural, which goes into Dolby, and makes their own algorithms. So it's a very, very difficult. It's the first time in history, I think, we have a totally moving target for delivery.
So does that mean that the actual channel configuration can be mixed
No,
up?
with not channel configuration, but distances. How you give each object and channel a metadata of how distant it should be from you in
Yeah.
the virtualization. That metadata is disregarded by Apple. And another thing we find with Apple is that the algorithms for how the rendering is performed changes from month to month. By every firmware upgrade of their pods and their Macs, their rendering changes. So it's a totally moving target.
Totally.
When you say the rendering, do you mean the processing that's actually happening inside the device?
Yes, because what happens is that, of course, it's very difficult to get hard facts out of Apple of what's happening in their delivery chain. What we do know is that a variant of the Dolby Atmos TD Plus is actually ported all the way through the Bluetooth into the AirPods, and the rendering is actually happening in the pods and not in your iOS or in your computer. So it's a firmware update of your earpiece that is actually deciding what goes on, how it's rendered. And it comes down to balance between the objects, placement of the objects, how much reverb is actually added by the algorithm, how much diffusion is kind of extracted from the whole image, the whole spatiality, that changes from month to month.
And does that also vary if, for example, you're not using, you got your iPhone and your Apple Music, but you've got some Jabra headphones?
Then you will actually not get the spatialization at all,
Right,
because
I see.
there's only the Apple headsets, and I think is there any third-party headsets enabled yet?
I don't think. Not
I
sure.
don't think so.
Right.
But it's the rendering, the virtualization is actually performed by the H1 chip in the earpiece.
I see. A moving target, like you said.
So the good thing about the services is that if if Apple Music, the service, if it does not recognize an Atmos compatible speaker system or a earpiece which is compatible with Atmos, it does not play you the fold down stereo. It actually goes to the Apple Music library and it finds the dedicated stereo mix. And that is what is streamed. And that is why the delivery specifications are so strict for us, because we have to be within, I think it's 50 milliseconds of the original stereo mix.
I think it's frames they're talking about, but it's probably 1 or 2 frames or something like that. I think. Yeah. So,
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
We have a few questions from the audience. So we should have a look at those. What is the optimal sitting position in a physical 714 Dolby Atmos environment?
Dead center.
Yeah, exactly. Dead center.
Dead center?
Yeah.
That done. Okay, and once a Dolby Atmos session is completed, are the mixers sending projects directly to clients or to a Dolby Atmos mastering person, or to both? That's
So
from Wayne.
technically, right now, mastering processes as we know it from stereo is not. So when I do a mix, I don't send it to any mastering. I just send it directly to the labels, or I upload it to the labels, because some of the delivery specific the specifications are just super big. So sometimes I hand in like 50 gigabytes or something like that. So it's super big. There's so much material that's actually going in Universal's case. You have to deliver a ADM for each individual track. You have a full ADM for the whole album, and .atmos file for the full album, and stereo ADMs for all of the tracks as well. And the stereo ADM is to take the stereo master and play it directly into the render as a stereo file, and then do another ADM of that. So that's, and since every single track is depending on, of course, how many objects you use, but it can be quite massive. So 1/2 gigabytes per song is pretty much the average, I would say. So it's quite a lot of material, and they send it, as far as I know, they upload it straight to Apple and Tidal and to the services straight from these files, as I know it. Maybe Morten can.
No, I would probably say that there's a industry difference between the different regions. Back in the old days, most stereo content went out of the mixing suite and into a commercial mastering studio. Then at the beginning of immersive, a lot was delivered as you describe it, directly from the mixing situations and into distribution. Several of the traditional mastering studios in the US is now taking a step back into the delivery chain. So the mastering studios is actually taking on a role again. I think not so much for work with singles, but when it comes to albums, the mastering engineers has found their new place in this system. And the fact is that you can in quite a lot of the workstations, you can actually import the ADM and perform a traditional mastering on the ADM files, and then re-export that as a new ADM, which is the final master. So it's a question of workflow between the studios, the traditional mastering engineers. But they are coming back into the game as a dedicated mastering facility again.
Yeah.
But you touched a point which a lot of the mastering studios, their main task was for decades to push the loudness war on behalf of their clients. With the delivery demands for immersive audio, we have very strict loudness guidelines, which hopefully will take the whole loudness war out when we come into immersive. So the mastering studios take on a different role now.
Yeah, and they also, as I know, has this whole binaural settings. So let's say that there's 5 different engineers doing each their binaural setup of the same artist, and then they have to put these into the same album. Then they would also need to place these into a new structure where the nears go to near and the mids go to mid and all these things, which is also,
and of course, if you look at if you look at what's happening with especially with the most current pop music for the last couple of years, it used to be the credits for an album used to be a recording engineer, a mix engineer, and a mastering engineer. Now all of those 10 tracks going into an album have a different producing team, and that team can be 12 people, you know. So that's one of the points where collective mastering actually starts to serve a new purpose also in immersive.
And especially if they all have different object structures in so the whole objects settings, if they are different from each production, then there's a lot of work to make that connected in one album. There's quite a lot of work there.
Yes.
Just finding the right places to put the right files.
I think we should pause the conversation there for a moment and move on to hear from Eddie, if that's all right. And then we'll come back to the longer discussion again afterwards. So Eddie Simonson he's the founder of Mainstream Studios, or co-founder, and he is a composer, sound designer, and engineer. And as far as I know, you work only with TV and film, or do you also do some music?
Not much.
Not much, yeah. So
No.
he is working in a different field, and I suppose that Dolby Atmos is an even bigger part of your everyday working life. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about your background and your studio and your the tools that you're using, and the challenges you have with on the film and TV side. That would be great.
Yeah, my name
Welcome.
is Eddie. I founded Mainstream with my good friend and partner and brilliant sound guy, Hans Møller. And we run a facility called Mainstream. We have like, I think, 5 Atmos rooms these days. And I started out like, I think, Frank, maybe you can help me there, 3 or 4 years ago, working in Atmos. But for us, it's a different ball game in post-production because we've been working immersive in a much smaller size, though, from the early days. We used to have a center channel in the old Dolby systems, and these days we run full Atmos in many rooms all the time because we find that the whole Atmos thing is very inspiring. We don't have the same sort of problems as the music guy does because basically what we do is either the Atmos mix or we deliver a 2-track, not binaural. So we have to make that work one way or another. And since in film and TV, a lot of people actually bought 5.1 setups and small sound bars that can run Atmos. Not that they sound good, all of them, but it's a different world than the music guys. Secondly, there's a better hold on, I think, to a certain degree at least, on the whole loudness thing. We have some specific, for cinema, for instance, you can mix as you want. But as soon as you are in a TV world, you have different loudness measurements that you have to meet, depending on which company you're mixing for. It's different from, let's say, Danish TV2 or for Netflix. It's quite different. Basically because Netflix wants their sound to be a bit more cinematic. That means a bit more dynamic in a way. And secondly, because most TV stations these days don't send Atmos anyway. So that's a challenge we meet in our industry. But one thing I will say, though, is that working in Atmos, at least in post-production, which is quite different because we built up, this sort of sound space ourselves, is quite inspiring in a way. It's like it gives a new life to our job. Instead of hard-pressed TV mixes these days, we can do more cinematic mixes. It's so much more fun, and in a way, I think it translates into the 2-track mix as well. They become a bit more interesting to listen to because you have more space to fill, and in a way, you create a more dense 2-track mix from the Atmos mixes than you would setting out doing just a stereo mix. So in our world, it's not all happy-go-lucky, but at least it makes sense. I discussed a lot with Frank, who's the only musician I know who also makes Atmos, and I can see all the requirements they meet with their binaural. I stay away from them. I spend less time worrying about that. And these days, what I can do and what I tend to do is just export an MP4. I can bring it to my car. I can bring it to my home studio, my home TV environment, and I can watch it in Atmos and check out that it sounds okay, which is quite nice. We have a lot of other problems though, but we can get into that a little later. Yeah, I think I'll try to keep it short because I see the time is running, and maybe we also would like to hear what Morten has to say a little further on.
Sure. Oh, well, we have a question from Xin Hui. Can the current technology deliver spatial audio such as 7.1 for live performance online? Maybe that's not a question for you.
Nope, definitely not. I think that's Frank.
But I can tell you because I just not so long ago got an email from Dolby that they have created a Dolby Atmos live music tool. So you now can have a render connection on your iPad, and then you can do a real-time spatial movement of all your objects on the iPad, and then you can store these iPad settings and then recall them from either MIDI or OSC and stuff like that. So yes, it's possible. I am not sure that this app has been released yet. Very soon after I got the email, I tried to find it on Dolby's homepage, but I couldn't. So I don't know if it's about to be released or, but it sure will come. So
On
it's
the way.
there
Hmm.
at least very soon.
Excellent. Eddie, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I just need to remember what it is. It was. I was saying that. Oh yeah, I was gonna ask about your actual process. I was speaking to some uh, kind of dubbing people at the weekend, and some of the people I studied with who now work in London, and they were saying they tend to now they mix in seven, I have to remember it correctly, 712, and then they will uh, do, remix, maybe not remix, but tweak in stereo, and then check it again in 712. Is this a kind of process that you would use, or you are you checking your mixes in
But
stereo
actually,
along the way?
I'm checking my mixes along the way because when you do TV series, time is of essence. And basically, what I have here is that I have like two systems. I have an MK based 7.4, I think 7.1.4, and then I have a 9.6.4 system for a more cinematic experience. And I tend to switch forth and back, and then I check all the downstream, the 5.1, the 7.1, and the 2-track along the way. And then if I need to do corrections, I do it along the way.
Yeah, okay. Because last week we had Dolby on the webinar, and before that I was a bit confused about the whole process and how, like, this must take you weeks compared to how you used to work before. But they said, no, no, it's just a simple tool and you just export it. It's not going to add on any extra time to your
Yeah, but
to your
actually,
working
actually, you
day.
could do it in real time because through the renderer, you can listen to the different down mixes, and one of the things that I find is that basically you should, before you do anything in Atmos, you should sort of develop your taste in Atmos. I think that goes for all of us. How do you use it? What do you use it for? Do you want voices in the surrounds, and why would you want that? How do you use it? And I think in a way you can be fairly conservative when you do the TV series. So you use it for stuff that expressly should go into all the channels. Uh, and also, I tend not to use a lot of upmix stuff. Like, for instance, I would never use a recording that was recorded on 4 tracks, for instance, of an atmosphere. I would rather use two different atmospheres that sort of go together well, and put one in the front, another in the back, or maybe a third in the backgrounds. So they make up something completely different. Where I tend to find that if you use the 5.1 recordings, for instance, then you fold it down to 2-track, it becomes too much of the same thing because they all original from the same place. That's quite different, I find, when you mix scores, for instance, like people like Morten would have recorded. Uh, then it's all of a sudden it makes sense to use all the microphone, all the outriggers, all the back microphones, and you do a more static placement of the whole recording. But in I think in post production, what you want is something that moves all the time, and you can do that if you have different atmospheres. The only thing you can move if you have a 5.1 recording is you can move the actual volume on it, and maybe add a bit of EQ, but basically it becomes a little bit uninteresting in my opinion anyway. So what we try to achieve by building up by different layers in post production is a sense of movement, like you're in the woods, so that the winds would move around you. But there would also need to be something that is more static because it seems to please the ear more, and all of us want to avoid the exit sign effect where you go like, "What the fuck was happening in the background?" Because then you're taken away from what's happening on picture. And
Yeah.
that's another thing that goes for what Frank does and Morten does, is that when you have post production, you always have the lead vocal on, which is basically the picture. So you want to stay with the picture. You don't want to take away attention from what's going on the screen. Whereas when you do music, I think in a way it's a more emotional because you want to get into the music, but you do that in your imagination, not through a picture.
Yeah,
So it's quite different, and in a strange way, it's the same. But I think you have to approach it a little different.
I think it's
I
nice
have a
that you
question.
have some more standards and a few rules in there, so
Yeah, 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 yeah.
you're not just dealing with 1,000 variables. Yeah,
I
go
have a
ahead,
question for
Mark.
you, Eddie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you still create a dedicated stereo mix, or do you rely on the fold down to stereo from your full Atmos?
The in the beginning, I actually did a dedicated stereo mix because a lot of the clients require that. But as I made my MP4s, which is an Atmos mix with a picture that I can check around all around. I'm getting more used to actually rely on the stereo mix that is actually from the Atmos file,
Yeah.
and it seems to play really beautiful. I must say, I have been against it for quite a long time because I thought I could do it better, but apparently it works quite well. I find, but again, there's rules. Depends on how much you want to do. One of the things that I noticed on the first Atmos mixes was that everything was moving all the time. And what happens is that if everything is moving, nothing is moving because it just becomes a blur of movements, but it doesn't make any sense. So you have to take care of what you do actually. And I find that if you work with static backgrounds that move a little bit, and then you can have, let's say for instance, you were to do a rain in a forest, you would have a sort of a more static background of wind maybe, and then you could actually move the rain. But if it's one thing without the other thing, it doesn't really work because you become too aware of what's going on. But if you blend those two, the static part with the moving part, it seems to be so much more natural. That's what I find anyway. Does it make any sense?
Yeah.
Totally.
I would only wish, and I think for the future also, that we were allowed slightly more fields of metadata to be
Exactly.
able to give instructions on how the fold down to a diminishing number of speakers should be performed. That would actually solve a lot. We have some. Um, I noticed that most Atmos deliveries are left to the default values, the automated fold downs. But we actually do have the option of setting manual values to the fold downs. And I think we should more and more use those depending on our content.
Yeah, of course. Again, I will say that this is, I think our industries in a way are the same. It's always a matter of time, and we always have too little. So for me, security is a big thing. So
Yeah.
the one thing that I can do to be secure about what I do is actually to listen in environments that I know at home, in my car, and different places. And does the mix behave the way it should? Then I'm quite confident handing it out. I always experiment. Could I do it any better? Could I change the default settings? Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's a lot worse. So not being sure how to get it better all the time, or can you apply one thing that goes off all the time, or do you have to tweak a little bit every time? Often I don't have the time. Also, in our case, we would send everything to like QC. For instance, if you go for Netflix, it will be QC'd several times through different vendors, as far as I know. And then after I've done that, after I've done the Atmos mix, then they have to QC the 5.1 mix, which was made from the Atmos mix. If they then have corrections in the 5.1 mix, I have to go back to the now approved Atmos mix and change that so that the 5.1 mix will be okayed. And that could be quite tedious. So I tend to be fairly strict about what I do. And I find that one of the ways is to be a little bit conservative about how much I mess around with things, how much I move stuff, and that's another thing is that if you do a Transformer movie, which is great sound work, there's a lot of parts going on all around you. But most films that we do in Scandinavia, they might have a burning car if they can afford that. but it's mostly two people in an apartment, so you don't want to go all crazy. Maybe that's one of the reasons I find that the lot of the stuff that I do in Atmos, which actually has Atmos stuff in it, it sounds pretty good in 2-track as well.
I love it. So you've become an expert at creating like awkward silences.
Yeah, but
And
that's one thing. But what I will say though is that when I started practicing, because I practiced a year before, because I couldn't get my head around what Atmos actually was. In my opinion, it was basically a big panner that could do what we always wanted, a pan to every speaker. But I found out it's more of a work method. So basically what you do your stems. I tend to rely heavily on stems. I would have the effect stems, and I have to deliver those as well. But I work with stems, and then I've sort of lost it. I can't remember where I started, so sorry. But anyway, I work in stems, and I have to deliver in stems. So I find that when you're mixing out now I'm jumping again, but when you mix, you can often do immersive that you're not aware of. And now I know where I wanted to start out. When I started doing this, I did this without picture, just to have a sense of what's going on. I had a trip to New York, so I tried to mimic that whole trip that I had sitting in a park bench in New York. Could I do that immersively here and have the correct feeling? How do I get that? And practice a bit, because a lot of it is about taste. It's not about the sound guy. You don't want to do stuff so people would say, he's really good. He can pan, swoosh through the ceiling speakers. It doesn't make any sense. It always have to sort of connect to the picture one way or another. So in that way we have some restrictions, but restrictions can be good. I often wonder how guys like Frank, or Morten for that matter, how do you decide to pan a Caracas through all the speakers? Does it make any sense? I have no idea. But in my world, it's all connected to the picture. So in that way, I think it's easier. And actually, I think it does a lot of good for us sound guys in post-production on film and TV. I'm getting a little nerdy, I know, but I love this.
But I think I tend to do the same about that to create some kind of a space that makes sense. So why should the keyboard players play behind you unless he has
I have no
surround?
idea.
No, exactly. I also don't know why he should. But if it has some kind of a creative idea about back to the Bob Marley, for instance, they are placed so that he's dead center, and then they are placed around him, and you can hear that it's the same vocalists that's in the same speakers.
Yeah.
And then it makes sense. But if they would start moving, then it would stop making sense. Then it would simply
exactly.
then it wouldn't work. But then you see there's for instance Yellow, who's this electronica. Is that a duo? Yes, it is. Who's done the latest album is Atmos, and it's I think it's simply the most moving Atmos album I've heard, and it's super cool. But they use it in a way where it makes the electronic music elaborate. It simply just gets more interesting, at least for me.
Okay.
And therefore it makes sense that it moves, because it gets better. And you don't move things if it doesn't get better. It needs to be
No.
it needs to have a purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry. Or
No,
don't
it's
apologize.
okay,
That's
because
great.
it is something I think most of us sort of fight with. Should we do Atmos because we can, or should we use it where it makes sense? And I think, like listening to the classical guys, I think, Morten, you're classical in a way.
Sort of.
Talking about the more static setups, it makes a lot of sense, because what you get is the sense of being there. but then there's other things where it doesn't make that kind of sense, especially if you have an apartment, for instance. Yeah, you can have somebody using the loo on the top, but is it interesting? Not really. So there's also a lot of consideration in how do you use it and why do you use it. And I think, right now what we have to is to promote it. But secondly, it's going to be how are we going to have the experience with the end listener as Morten, Frank, and I have in our studios. That's the big problem right now. Because in my opinion, the binaural mix in Apple, it doesn't sound good. It sounds like in the old days when you had an amplifier for your TV and you could put on THX Cinema and then it would add some reverb and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't necessarily becomes better. But maybe I didn't listen enough. But I think in that way we are fortunate in the film business. We don't have to do that much of it.
No.
To be honest, Eddie, I totally agree with you. I have not yet heard any binaural that matches the dedicated stereo mix when it comes to
Or the
headphones.
Atmos mix for that matter, yeah.
Yes. So what very early in this process, I gave up on the binaural, and my attitude is okay. Those who listen to headphones and virtualization, okay, it's fine. It sounds as it does this week, next week. Maybe it sounds different from Apple next month. But I'm arrogant enough to say I'm creating this for that 0.02%, which actually has a speaker environment.
I do
And
the same.
those guys are really, really happy. And that's what I work with.
Yeah, but we all
Martin,
do, and in a way that's you have to have that approach because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. But I can see.
And it's the only fixed reference we have currently.
Yeah, the speaker system.
Yeah.
yeah. And Martin, can I interrupt and get you to do a very delayed introduction to yourself?
Yeah.
And because we've already heard a lot from you, but maybe you would just like to say, mention your studio and your label and the kind
Oh,
of work that
let's
you're doing.
let's rather talk a little bit about the approach we chose to immersive music, because I work very different from the traditional studio setting. So I do not mix for Atmos. I record for an immersive environment. And to me, the codec should just provide a transparent transport from what I create with the musicians and the composers into the homes of people. And that I've been working immersive music with full energy for more than a decade now, way earlier than when Dolby had their Atmos ready. So I started out working in the Auro 3D configuration, and I found that the transition into distributing that in Atmos has been pretty painless, actually. So I'll just pick up my screen here. There we go. That would be my typical microphone array, picking up what's happening. And as you might see, the configuration of the microphones mimics a miniaturized version of a 7.1.4 speaker layout. So with this microphone array, we pick up in the same intensity and time of arrival that the speakers would release it in the playback environment. And the best process I experience is when we can bring the composers, the musicians into our studio, let them experience immersive audio. Then the composer goes back and writes his piece. At some point in his writing process of composition, he will come back and we will start to find a recording layout for the musicians. And this is just an example of how we may end up. And to the question of why do we do this stuff? Why do we place this and that instrument behind you or on the side or dead front? It all needs to come out of the music. So if I work with a living composer, my work is to motivate him to take an active choice in imagining how the sonic soundscape can pan out in immersive. If it is a historic composer, especially in classical music, my starting point is to dive into the music and try to figure out how could this composer have imagined his voices, his counterparts, his coming together, his conflicting parts in the music. How could that be translated into a three-dimensional space? And also the advantage with a dedicated recording session is that we don't have to be restricted by the commercial aspect of an audience area and a stage area. We are just thinking a big space where anything can happen. So after we have agreed on a recording layout, then it all needs to be translated to the actual venue. So I'll just browse you through a couple of photos from that drawing.
Do you also have some wider outriggers?
No,
No, just
only the main microphone array, which represents the listener, and that means that the imaging of each instrument is decided by the actual placement in the room. The balance between the instrument is decided by the distance to the microphone array. Yeah, so it's all natural.
and so then you work with
No close miking.
no close mics.
No, no,
And you work with the musicians to get to either put them on a plinth or with the height and the distance in that way.
exactly.
Yeah.
And raising them up on raisers, moving them further back, changing the angling between the microphone and the whole orchestra, change it. That's my EQ.
Wow.
Wow.
It takes time, doesn't it, Morten?
Yeah, but there is a magic moment where everything snaps and says yes, and that moment is so beautiful, and that's when we start recording.
And then you don't have to edit, well, maybe edit. You're not mixing afterwards, of course.
Nope.
Wow.
So that's basically the holistic approach of music making in immersive audio. Yeah, I have two particularly two aspects that I would like to raise without having any fixed answer to it, but which I've observed by, because this studio room is also a QC room for a lot of different genres than what I work with myself. So we get a lot of pop music through here, just for checking that everything is behaving as it should. We have a 9.1.4 system, which is basically the biggest configuration you would find in home cinema. You could have 6 speakers in the ceiling, but we have 4. And the first one is the center channel. I would just encourage us all to have a very conscious relationship between how we anchor a focal point in the center in the front, and that we choose either a phantom solution or a hard center solution, not one or the other, but that we have a conscious relationship to it. I find more and more, maybe because of the major label restrictions in their guidelines, that people are just making phantom centers and are very, very scared of using the hard center in a proper way. So that's just a cry of encouragement. Use the hard center if you find it appropriately. And also because in the movie sound, the center would often be reserved for some type of dialogue. So us music guys, we are just told to stay off the center when it comes to scoring. But for music making, it's there for us. Let's use it. I'm not saying that phantom center is not appropriate, because it can have, it sounds very different than a hard center. So use it according to what the music invites you to. That's one thing about center. The other thing I observe is the LFE channel. It seems like a lot of the mixing tradition today is to use the LFE as a volume enhancer for the low end of your main content. And I think it is because a lot of smaller mixing studios does not have fully proper main channels. A lot of the mixes are done on speaker that rolls off at 40 hertz. And then to get more low end, they duplicate from the main channels into the LFE. That can get you into a lot of trouble later on in the process when it comes to bass management in the consumer environment. But most importantly, if you use the LFE as what it's supposed to be, a low frequency effect channel, not a woofer extender, but an effect channel. If you use that selectively and kind of save that extra power from that one grand casa that's supposed to knock you off your chair, that's very efficiently. Because what I see by just pushing all the low end from mains into the LFE, you're actually trying to do bass management on behalf of the consumer. That's not your task. Let that happen in the end stage. I think that's my two main reactions to two things that comes through our studio for QC, and also I spend quite some time listening to what is actually published now in the first wave through Apple Music and Tidal. Yeah.
Thank you very
Okay.
much, Martin, for sharing
Yep.
your thoughts and also the pictures. It's very interesting to see your setup. So just with the LFE channel, do you mean that a lot of people are putting too high frequency content in the LFE
No.
channel?
No. Okay. Now you're raising another question. I just want to remind you guys that the LFE channel of your delivery format, the ADM file, is actually full bandwidth. And you should shape it. You should put the low pass filter on it. When the ADM transitions to a DD Plus or any other end delivery systems, then the bandwidth reduction is done. But just know that your full range content is in the LFE, in the ADM. What was your question again, Shelley?
My question was, do you find, so when people are coming through your studio to quality, to QC things, do you find that a lot of them are putting too much, like, I don't know what frequency, too high frequency content in the LFE channel,
Yeah.
and then it's messy because
Yes.
things are canceling out, and yeah.
No, yes, they should. No, sorry. Yes, they do.
They do that,
In
yeah.
90%. But in the end, it doesn't matter when it's distributed to consumers, because then it is shaved off at 120 hertz anyhow. So it will never reach the consumer. But for archive reasons, you need to be careful. But what I experience is that most mixes turn up the aux from all the channels in the bed to go into the LFE with a certain amount. And that makes for a total mess. So your electric bass will be down there, your kick drum will be down there, everything in your mix is put down there as a bass extender or a volume knob. But it turns out 9 out of 10, it turns out very, very messy and just this kind of gruntling sound.
Yeah, and you have less control because you've no idea how people are listening back.
Yeah.
It's higher risk kind of
You would
mixing.
never do that, Frank, huh?
Yes.
Sorry, Frank.
I would never don't. But the thing is, I think that I've also been pushed from some QCs here to actually. So how do we get more low end?
Hmm.
And that's it's also a way of.
But then you should push low end into your main channels.
Yeah, that's true.
And also another point, Frank, is that the fact that the argument I meet is that, oh, but what if people doesn't have an LFE channel and I put this bass synthesizer down there,
Yeah.
then they won't get it. Yes, they will get it, because there should be a bass management. If the consumer has a system and says, I have no LFE channel, then the processor should put that content into the main channels. And then people again say, yeah, but what if people haven't set up their system right? Okay, that's the limit.
Yeah, but of course not. But I see that some of the usage of the LFE, especially in the things that I have done, is meant as a supplement, and very subtle supplement of the low end. It's not that it's it's not that it's supposed to play 100 hertz in the sub. It's supposed to play this very low. So right now I'm mixing is for instance a setup where there's 6 kick drums, for instance. Then I put one of them in there, because then one of them, and they are not playing. It's not 6 kick drums like this all the time. Of course they are playing. Some of them are playing in offs, and that, and then it gives a super nice feel that some of them has this oomph, and some of them don't.
Yeah, absolutely, Frank.
It really depends on how you use it in the material, and also if I tend to do it more when if you have like a keyboard, like a Moog bass or something like that, that's supposed to be extraordinary deep.
Yeah.
So if I hear that the stereo that I hear has super low end included, I did some things for a Danish hip hop artist, and in his mixes there was so much low end, and then of course I tend to somehow, how do I get the same feeling? It's also supposed to be exaggerated when they hear it on their home studio or their home setup. So it really depends on, again, why do you use it? So and that's exactly what in this case of using it as an extension and as a provider of uh, like a base management system, that doesn't work. That's true.
No, and you're absolutely right. It was I was probably unclear because that's a beautiful example of how it should be done. What I meant is that if you have one mono source, if you have one bass guitar,
Yeah.
then put it in the main channels or in the LFE.
Yeah.
If you really want that low pumping stuff, then it should be produced like that. So you would probably have a bass guitar line, and you would have a subsonic synth pad enhancing that deep feeling of that bass. Then you should not put both of them
No.
identically in both.
No.
You should pick one in the main channels and one in the LFE and let them come together at the end user base management.
Yeah.
And the thing I'm reacting to is the exact duplication of content from the main channels going totally into the LFE as well.
Yeah. Totally.
Thanks for clearing that up. Maybe before we wrap it up, we can take a few questions from the audience, mostly from Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne. So from Nicholas, do you know what the target is for Apple Spatial Audio? Do they aim to simulate a certain speaker setup that you could mix towards and practically recreate speakers? Did they change this over time? Is Apple here with us today in the audience? No, we have some contacts there, some Danes working in Silicon Valley who could perhaps answer. I don't know if you guys know
No.
what Apple's reference is.
If I should do a general, I would say that if they adhere to the concept of Atmos, they should not be thinking in terms of speakers and speaker placements at all.
No, they should be
I,
thinking in terms of space.
yes,
Yeah.
I guess they have some kind of reference setup that they would like to test against. Yeah.
So we do not have a clear answer for that, but we can try and find out. So from Wayne, Eddie, are there any online documents that provide standard practices of dialogue, effects, and music placements?
Not that I know of. But again, it's pretty much what Morten says in a way, because it has to be logical in a
Yeah.
way. So in our industry, we use the center channel all the time. It's the most important channel, actually. And as Morten says, we tend not to put too much there because it's sort of reserved for dialogue, but that doesn't mean that nothing goes there other than dialogue. I tend to like sometimes when, especially with scores actually, if I can have a little bit of center, because I think it becomes a little bit boring also if you sit in these days, the cinemas are quite wide. And if you only have left-right going on, it would all depend on where you sit. So I tend to have a little bit, if it's there from the recordings, something in the center channel as well when I mix. Basically what I do is that I set up something. The reason why I do all the stems is that later on I have to deliver, and the good thing about the renderer is that it's so fast at doing all the down mixes, all the the effects stem, the background stem, the dialogue stem. But I'm not sure there's any reference because you do what fits the film, and sometimes it might ask for dialogue in all channels, very seldomly, but it does once in a while, and then you can do that. But I think common sense in a way. And that means that pretty much a lot of the narrative is going on the screen. And then you use the rest of the speakers as an extension, at least in the conservative way. Then you can go crazy once in a while and use all the speakers. But it's a little different because also like when you mix pop music, I find that one of the things is that pop music is quite loud. The dynamics today is very small compared to film. In film, it's all about quietness, and then it can be loud, and then it has to be quiet, loud and quiet. That calls for emotions. If you're loud all the time, it doesn't work. If you're quiet all the time, it becomes a little bit boring. So again, it's a ride. It's like writing a symphony just for sounds, and then try to bring that to the narrative of the story, and that goes along with that. And for that setup, I think the whole Atmos thing is pretty nice, because you can really do stuff that nobody noticed, but actually, if you took it away, they would notice, because it's there, and it sort of immerses you and tells the story. In that regard, I really love Atmos, and I think it's, to be honest, and I think that goes for all immersive. Why is modern going through all the trouble? It's because the experience, when you succeed with something that is immersive and you have the true feeling, it's so overwhelming. I think Frank does do it for the same reason, that when you sit in your room, it's correct and everything sort of melts together. It's a beautiful moment. That's all I can say.
Can I add
Oh,
to that, Eddie? Because it's when we first I started out in stereo, and I was immediately starting to search for higher resolution in the sonics, and found that in surround sound. And when we then were going from surround sound to immersive, my expectation was that we would have more of that resolution. What we found that was that no, there wasn't more resolution. The height component was adding a strong emotional component to the experience, more than actual resolution. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think actually what happens when it works best is that you actually get immersed. Sometimes
Yeah.
in my line of work, you don't have to notice. You have to watch the film, and then you just have to be carried away. So the more you notice the sound, the worse a sound guy I am. Where you guys work a little different, I think the better it sounds, the better you are. But the whole thing is about immersiveness. We want to seduce the audience one way or another, and I think that immersive is really good at that. Standing in a concert room, in the middle of the concert can be chilling, because it's actually immersive in real life, and that to bring that experience to an audience is fantastic. I love mixing scores, because it's quite different from doing what do you say, sound, because it's different, and it's also about the orchestra and how they. And that's why I can relate to the way that you record, but I can't stop wondering, how does he get the time to do that? Because and when the strings are a little bit off,
Yeah.
how do you hide it in reverb and stuff that I would normally do?
No, but you have to make sure they aren't off.
Yeah,
That's the
I
whole
know,
thing.
but that takes time.
So yes, it takes time. So with a professional setup, we have
And good
at
musicians, yeah.
least, and good musicians, we have at least 5 long days of recordings.
Okay.
So when scoring is often pushed through on maybe 2 days, 4 sessions, but for music recordings like this, we need 5 days for an album recording.
Yeah, that makes sense, because we often have
Yeah,
1.5 day with an orchestra
yeah,
playing somewhere in Budapest or somewhere, and then you
yeah,
have to fix all the flaws afterwards.
yeah. It's totally different. I saw a very important question there, Shelley. It's gone out of the list now, but it was a
sorry.
question about sample rate. And because everyone thinks that you can only do 48K with Dolby Atmos, that's simply not true. I make the whole production workflow within the Pyramix workstation. I don't use the Dolby renderer at all. My Dolby output is just an export functionality directly from the Pyramix workstation. And within Pyramix, I can do the recording, the whole workflow in 352.8 kilohertz. So it's super high resolution. The only points where I use the renderer is for QCing, checking that all the fold downs work, to setting the fold down parameters, and to set the binaural values before I export. But still, I do not export the final ADM through the Dolby renderer. that is now a built-in functionality of the Pyramix workstation.
Okay,
And
that's
the
great to
fact
know.
is, if you work in Pro Tools or any other situations where your workflow is to keep the Dolby renderer on a real time, if you're mixing through the renderer, you can still work at 96K. The whole thing works perfectly fine in 96K. And that means your project archive would be slightly more future-proof than our current deliveries. And you can export your project in the .atmos format at 96K 24-bit. Our current limitation is when you export the ADM for the delivery services. That's the point where you have to come down to 48K. So
you
I'd
mean for
encourage,
like to Netflix or something? That's when you have to go down.
yes, whoever you are delivering to,
Mm-hmm.
the point where you go to the ADM file format, which is your delivery, then the 48K is the standard. But
Yeah.
I would encourage everyone to try to work at 96K through their project.
Thank you, Martin.
And
I
then I can add on a little funny thing from my end is that I have to up sample everything from 44.1. So I haven't had yet a session at all that came in just 48K.
Wow.
Oh, that was delivered to you. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I start by doing the up sample from 44.1 to 48. That's where it starts.
Look
So
how
mine
upset Morten is.
That means we have some educational work to do.
exactly.
The Recording Academy in the US, the P&E wing, did a great job a couple of years ago, making the best practice recommendations to bring the whole music recording industry up to 96K or higher.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the whole Dolby Atmos, with the impression that 48K is the new standard, has taken away some of that motivation at the recording studios, and actually brought where we had a couple of years where the standard was 96K in music production, especially in the US industry. We are now down to 48K again, unfortunately. So we need to revive that information flow and bring up the digital resolution on our workflow. Even though the output to the consumer services are 48K currently. But there is nothing in the open source ADM standard that prevents an ADM from being higher resolution than 48K.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you for your answer about that. And sorry, I answered them myself. I just wrote that I'm sure Martin records in as high a resolution as possible. But I wasn't expecting you to say 350. Yeah. Okay, we have Eddie again.
Sorry.
Welcome back. But also we are running over time, so
Yeah.
it's
But
unfortunately we have to.
actually, the three of us are going to continue afterwards because I think we have a lot to share.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be great to do this a real life event at some point. But yeah,
Totally.
thank you very much for being here today and for sharing your thoughts. I think we've covered a lot of topics, and I will certainly send this recording to Dolby, Fraunhofer, and the BBC, who
Whoops,
might be
what have I
interested
said?
here. And then I have some homework to find out what Apple's reference system is. So I'll try and do that as well. But yeah, thank you. It was great to hear you're really coming from quite different corners of the industry and working in different ways. So yeah, thanks for being here. And to our audience, please take a moment to fill in the questionnaire so we get a little bit of feedback, and that helps us to create better events in the future as well. Um, yeah.
And thanks for the patience.
Yeah, exactly.
All the long
Okay.
answers.
No, it's great to hear you speaking about it. You're all very passionate. Do you have anything else to say, guys, before we wrap it up? That's a no.
Uh,
Yeah.
Move
we
more.
have okay, sorry. I'll try to keep it short. Uh, being a kind of a new format, new traditions. The film industry has, in many ways, created their own ways of working with this, their own standards, their own way of calibrating their studios. We in the music industry, we kind of come fresh in from the sideline, grabbing a new format. There are some differentiating views on our target, and that goes to calibration of our target. And that's a kind of an open debate at the moment that we should all be aware of, because the recommendations officially from Dolby is that there should be a kind of modified X curve being your calibration target or your monitoring. Some of our American colleagues follow that, others don't. Dolby Europe has given us an okay to use a linear target for our mixing, but I just want us to be aware and conscious about the problem when we get a mix into our studio which has been done elsewhere, which might sound a little harsh in the top, then there is probably a different target curve in the studio where it comes from. I don't know
Okay.
if
No, I
Frank and
would say
Eddie
I
would
never
like to.
receive anything from the outside. Apart from full sessions that would need to be mixed one
Yeah.
way or another, or something that I need to create myself or with the staff here. So I haven't experienced that, but I know for sure, since I'm running I have an X curve on my big system, and I have
Yeah.
a sort of a home entertainment system, which it is not, but near field setup for home entertainment, and I have a little roll off at the top, which seems to make sense when you work for television anyway. It's not known to have a full frequency speakers and stuff like that, but it's a very light one. And it comes from practice more than from Dolby or anybody else. It seems to work, and it translates really well if you go to the big cinema as well. And also, I can actually remove it, so I can have it in and out. And also, by the way, you mentioned, which is a good little thing to have in the end, but bass management in the renderer, you can add bass management, and I urge everybody, when you've done your first mixes, try to put on bass management to make sure that what you put in your channels is sort of fitting for your final mix, because what's going to happen is that everybody's going to it's going to put it into the subwoofer at some point for all the homeowners who has small satellite speakers and a big sub, and it might sound messy. So take extra care to make sure that your mix is playing coherent on every sort of scaling or every different sort of speaker system, so you can play from big to small and it still sounds correct. And you're completely right. Don't put anything in the left, right, straight to the low frequency or to the LFE because it doesn't make any sense.
We've
That
all
was just a
agreed on
little thing.
that.
Sorry.
We've all agreed on that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. But it's been
Yeah.
so nice meeting you all, and thanks you again for the patience. And I have to
For
smoke
the
now.
patience. Yeah. Please go ahead. Have a good evening, everyone,
Same.
and
Bye bye.
stay
Yeah.
up to date with our webinars.
Okay. Bye
We'll be
bye.
back soon. Bye.